Rumor has it that Chris Evans may be returning to the role of Captain America. Quick sidebar here. As an Irish person, while I think Chris Evans was phenomenal in the role of Steve Rogers, I will admit that I was quite happy when he stepped aside, in large part because it meant that I could stop confusing him with the host of The Big Breakfast and Top Gear. While I'm sure Billie Piper's ex-boyfriend would make a fantastic Captain America in his own right, I think it's safe to say that that would be a very different Captain America franchise. End sidebar. Of course, the reports make it clear that Evans would not be stepping back into the role full-time for Captain America 4. Instead, there's some suggestion that Evans could reprise the role in a minor capacity for a few films, or even, presumably given the company's priorities, a streaming series, like his cameo appearances in Thor: The Dark World or in Spider-Man: Homecoming. Theoretically, this should be good news. With no disrespect to Matt Salinger, Evans is the defining live-action Steve Rogers.
Would you please pull over the car? I am going to get sick.
However, it's not hard to react to this news with some sense of trepidation. After all, Evans got his big goodbye sequence in Endgame, and the departure of both Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. from the Marvel Cinematic Universe served to draw a definitive line under the stretch of 22 movies, and yes, it's 23 if you decide to count Spider-Man: Far From Home as an epilogue, which you probably should, that constituted the Infinity Saga. One stage of the MCU was over, and a new one was set to begin. Endings are important, particularly in the context of popular culture that has grown increasingly fixated on nostalgia. So much of modern pop culture is built on established brands and known intellectual property being constantly recycled. So much media is built around rehashing familiar concepts and resurrecting beloved characters, often played by veteran actors, that there's little sense of growth or progress. It's no longer enough to just keep making new Batman and Spider-Man movies. Now, new iterations of these characters need to tether themselves to older iterations to feed fandom's nostalgia centers. It doesn't matter that the DCU is unlikely to produce anything as weird as Tim Burton's Batman, or as inappropriately horny as Tim Burton's Batman Returns. Only the fans recognize Michael Keaton in the role. It doesn't matter that the MCU is not as earnest or as heightened as Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, only that people remember Tobey Maguire. So it seems natural that this debate should occur in the context of superhero movies. It reflects a tension that's been simmering through superhero comics for decades. A quote often credited to Stan Lee, whether fairly or not, suggests that comic books were designed to offer readers the illusion of change, rather than change itself. Once a particularly iconic iteration of a character imprints itself upon comic book fans, that version is unlikely to change. Of course, there have been cases where characters and concepts have dramatically changed in superhero comics. In the 50s and 60s, known as the Silver Age, new iterations of 40s superheroes like The Flash and Green Lantern hit the stands. The concepts were invented for a new era, the era of the space race, pushing towards science fiction rather than folklore or mythology. While the older iterations of the heroes, like Jay Garrick or Alan Scott, still hang around today in comics like Justice Society of America, they've largely been supplanted in public consciousness by later iterations like Barry Allen and Hal Jordan. Over time, it seemed like Barry Allen and Hal Jordan themselves might be supplanted, and that the comic book legacies of The Flash and Green Lantern might yet evolve. Barry Allen died in Crisis on Infinite Earths number 8 in November 1985. Hal Jordan had a breakdown and turned evil due to the destruction of his home city and the death of Superman. And really, who hasn't been there? Both characters were replaced by younger and newer heroes. Barry Allen was replaced by Wally West, and Hal Jordan gave way to Kyle Rayner. It felt like change. Inevitably, nostalgia was too strong a pull. As writers, editors, and artists who'd grown up with Barry Allen and Hal Jordan filtered into the industry, they pushed the intellectual properties back to their older configurations. Writer Jeff Johns and artist Ethan Van Sciver worked on two miniseries, Green Lantern Rebirth and Flash Rebirth, that reset the status quo. Never mind that many of the contemporary readers were too young to remember the continuity that was being restored. In this context, it's worth noting that Johns remains one of the architects of DC's cinematic universe, and the influence of Green Lantern Rebirth and Flash Rebirth are both very strongly evident, both on the Green Lantern movies starring Ryan Reynolds and also in the Flash TV series on the CW. However, at least for a little while, it seemed like comic book movies and the live-action shared universes they perpetuated might be spared this sort of nostalgic distortion. After all, films and television operated by a different set of constraints than comic book art. Characters on the page remain frozen in time forever, through the wonders of comic book time. Peter Parker can look 20 years old, no matter whether he's drawn in 1966 or 2016. In contrast, over long stretches of time, actors might lose interest, become unavailable due to scheduling conflicts, or even in extreme cases pass away. In doing so, the cinematic universe would have to evolve. The existence of a shared universe like the MCU pushes this idea to its logical extreme. While Warner Bros. And Sony could simply reboot and recast properties like Batman or Spider-Man, again and again, that option is not available to Marvel Studios. If the company wants to create new films or shows without Chris Evans or Robert Downey Jr., then that means making those movies or series without Steve Rogers or Tony Stark. Well, at least until the multiverse opens. That means deepening the roster and pushing new characters to the fore. In the wake of Endgame, announcements from Marvel Studios suggest that the company understands this. Natalie Portman will take center stage in Thor: Love and Thunder, mirroring Jane Foster's ascension to the role of Thor in the comics. The streaming series Falcon and the Winter Soldier will find Sam Wilson grappling with the weight of becoming Captain America, just as the character does in the comics. Even the announced streaming series Ironheart suggests that the MCU will be introducing Riri Williams as Tony Stark's successor, as she did in the comics by Brian Michael Bendis. Of course, the nature of comics means that these reinventions and reconceptualizations inevitably reverted to the status quo. Jane Foster hung up her hammer and gave the role back to Thor. Sam Wilson returned the shield to Steve Rogers. Riri Williams retired to the background when Tony Stark returned. However, without the involvement of actors like Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr., that option would not be open to Marvel Studios. Sam Wilson could be Captain America for an entire generation of fans. This is important. Blockbuster movies like Thor: Love and Thunder, and even streaming shows like Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Ironheart, will reach much larger audiences than monthly Captain America and Iron Man comics, and so can shape how a generation of fans see these characters. After all, many fans still see Jon Stewart as the default Green Lantern, because of his role in animated shows like Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. Harley Quinn is one of the most important new Batman characters of the past 3 decades, because she originated on television, rather than in the pages of the comic. However, the return of Chris Evans suggests that this forward momentum cannot be taken for granted. Evans is unlikely to return as Steve Rogers in a headline role, but the return of Steve Rogers as an ongoing concern for the MCU inevitably casts a shadow over Sam Wilson's move to the fore. It suggests that Chris Evans and Steve Rogers will always be the real Captain America, rather than treating the departure of the actor and character in Endgame as a definitive ending. There's value in closing the book on particular characters, in moving on and trying new things, even if it's easier to bask in nostalgia. Watching The Rise of Skywalker, and even if we're being frank, the second season finale of The Mandalorian, it's hard not to get the sense that Star Wars would do well to grow beyond the Skywalkers and their established family of characters. Modern franchises could learn from how Star Trek The Next Generation distanced itself from the original series in its middle years. At one point, even having a character say the name Spock sparked vicious arguments in the writer's room. This arguably becomes an even greater concern in an era where actors can be de-aged through technology and even entirely computer-generated.
让心如水，兄弟。也许有一天，你不需要用成功来定义。
One can't help but imagine that studios like Disney would be very interested in a future where computer-generated versions of Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. could be licensed out from the actors, or even their estates, in perpetuity. These sorts of changes would freeze superhero movies in time, like their comic book counterparts. I can't help but feel like this would be a bad thing. Chris Evans had a tremendous tenure as Captain America. It's time to let somebody else wield the shield. Maybe some stars and stripes aren't supposed to be forever. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was In the Frame.